Hello and welcome to our first episode of The Human in the Room. My name is Robert Tam, I'm a lawyer and a teacher, and I'm very grateful to have Andrew with us today.
Hi Robert, and hi everyone. My name's Andrew and I'm the CEO of Mission 2020 and was formerly the drafter of the Paris Agreement.
Wow. When I hear those words, drafter of the Paris Agreement, I immediately assume a lawyer, an amazing lawyer, and I also assumed lawyers all over the place, in the room, negotiating clauses, getting to yes. First time I mentioned this to you, you laughed. And you said the best place for the lawyers, ideally, was not in the room. So,
Well, there's something wrong with lawyers, and actually there were a lot of lawyers in the room. But the thing is that there's a lot of creative ambiguity in the Paris Agreement, and from a technical perspective, it's a terribly drafted agreement. If we had put all of the lawyers in charge of negotiating the agreement, there would never have been an agreement.
I hear you. So if you're not a lawyer, then what was your path to Paris?
Well, I'm an ecologist by training and political scientist. I suppose I kind of gave up the science to a certain extent, the doing of the science, and my path to sort of change has been around political change, the reason why I got involved in the international politics around climate was because working in Australia, so much of Australian climate politics is dependent upon trading nations. And I was told in no uncertain terms when I was working on climate here that unless there was a legally binding agreement that applied to all, then there'd be no movement on climate here.
We won't move unless that's a norm elsewhere.
Yeah.
Okay. So interesting background. Like I said, I think a lot of people assume must be a lawyer, but what about other people in the room? What are their backgrounds, experiences, qualifications? Who gets to negotiate the Paris Agreement?
Yeah, I think, traditionally the Framework Convention on Climate Change has had a very heavy scientific and technical background. Firstly, the treaty was really founded on understanding the science, and the role of the IPCC was very important in generating the knowledge base. It's a complex topic, also the negotiations happen in Bonn. They don't happen in New York, so that tends to put it out of the bubble of sort of the political negotiators. But because there's such technical issues at stake, that has been traditionally the case. Of course, Copenhagen changed all of that, because in that lead up to Copenhagen, heads of state got involved. It moved into foreign ministries, and then it collapsed. And so from Copenhagen through to Paris, the types of people in the room were much more political, and also much more activist. I think you began to see many more activist voices within the process, but also I suppose seasoned negotiators. So foreign ministries began to bring in more of their professional negotiators.
Oh, and you mentioned this before. You were saying quite a marked difference in the dominant type of consultants between Kyoto Protocol and Paris Agreement in terms of...
Yeah, I mean, most countries have their foreign affairs staff. They bring technical people with them in their delegations. Usually it's a minister who is responsible for the delegation, depending on the stage of the negotiations. But for many small countries, they are dependent upon, they don't have that capacity within the country. Sure. They don't have that skill base. So they are either, they buy in that capability, or non-government organisations or philanthropy help them to be able to do that.
Yeah, and that was my memory years ago in practice. And you'd often hear a story where a lawyer, perhaps from the West, would be representing a SID, small island developing state, and sometimes several of them at once, but having to negotiate against almost a team from one other developed country. So in terms of equal bargaining power information asymmetry, has that shifted over the years?
Well, I think that there is always going to be imbalances in power just because of the nature of the nation states here. But in terms of the delegations, yes, I think that is still the case. Although what's different here is that nations are not negotiating their national interest in detail, and so they tend to aggregate around particular issues that are important. And so you can achieve a pooling of resources, and that is how I think negotiators from small island developing states, least developed countries, have been able to match the sort of the power of negotiation teams from developed countries.
Do you have a case of perhaps some of those people coming across the other room saying, you might want to think about this, giving a little bit of advice, or is it still fairly separate?
Oh, no. I mean, there's also... I mean, if you could map the WhatsApp messages that are flying around the room,
yes,
it would be fascinating.
Yeah.
And there are many personal relationships. I mean, these people negotiate with each other over decades. So they form relationships. I mean, I'm sure there's been many marriages that have been sparked from the negotiations.
Love in a time of climate change.
Yeah. So no, all of those informal networks are actually very central to coming to an agreement. These are humans, right?
Yeah.
And ultimately, that's the fascinating thing about how you can bring a process to an agreement. You really, it is that social capital which gets to that point.
So on social capital, I mean, who else though is not in the room, and whose voices aren't we hearing that perhaps we should be?
Yeah, I mean, I think well, let's say in the UN process, the sovereignty of states is fundamental to negotiations. There are some processes that are more or less, but that's a fundamental tenet of treaty making. There are 9 constituencies in the UNFCCC process that are formally recognised, and so there are those voices in the room, and that includes trade unions and business and think tanks and and research and academia, youth and etc. So, but that is usually in the formal process, in the plenaries, in the rooms which are open. Most of the negotiations are happening in smaller rooms or in corridors, and but there are lots of innovations too. So in the lead up to Paris, the Climate Action Network they had this thing where they would have trackers. So you could be a tracker if you were like a young activist, and your job was to follow negotiators, and you'd follow them to the bathrooms.
Literally shadowing them.
Totally, yeah. You'd be in the urinal, and there'd be someone sitting next to you opening up a conversation, and they're quite a tracker. Yeah.
So for advocacy, for pressure, but also information, understanding where they might be going with negotiation.
Yeah, I mean, I think
interests.
Yes, and just trying to influence the thinking, But I think the other thing that's interesting about the process leading up to Paris was that the non-state actors became much more relevant, and that the reason for that was because they realised. I mean, historically, it has been business that have influenced the negotiations. Sure. But as climate action became more prevalent in society, you see that happening with cities, states and regions, investors, and businesses.
Things like C40, divestment.
Exactly. Yeah, they started to have an interest in the outcome, and they started to be much more active within the delegations. They were part of the delegations.
So that's quite a norm shift then, in terms of this is now legitimate to listen to this view and perhaps take it in this direction in terms of what we're measuring. Yeah,
that's right. But I think also structurally the negotiations changed from Durban, because prior to that, the least developed countries in AOSIS, they were looking at a top-down mechanism.
Sure.
And from there was a change in the sort of philosophy driven by individuals that had a different vision for how you drive change.
Sure.
And it was more bottom up, or sort of more of a hybrid model actually.
That's when we talked about this before. This is very much the idea of Elinor Ostrom, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, who talked about governing the commons, and that's sort of in one quote. There's no reason to think that bureaucrats and so forth are better at deciding what should be happening in ecosystems than the people on the ground who are most at stake.
Yeah.
And so the idea of a polycentric approach to governance. So I'm used to that from the international development sphere, and the shift from the Washington consensus, the neoliberal, the top down, to, as you say, the grassroots bottom up. Because we've got case study after case study that approach actually has been more sustainable, and if you want to use the old language, profitable in that sense, but part of the ecosystem, those social, ecological systems.
Yeah.
So has that really informed the sustainable development area as well?
Well, in the Rio process, you had these Type 2 initiatives, and they came under a lot of criticism for being greenwashing or sort of fake. And I must say that if you really scrutinise the outcomes from many of those Type 2 initiatives, it's hard to point to really tangible outcomes. And there was a lot of learning from that in the climate process. But when in the Durban mandate, there are two tracks that open up. The first is the negotiation of the agreement, and the second is this attempt to bridge the gap in emissions. And the approach that the islanders take is a practical one. So they say, let's get technical experts in the room and let's open up a conversation in very specific areas about how we're going to reduce emissions and also build resilience and become, adapt to the impacts of climate change. And so, going to your point about who are the voices in the room, there were, in the lead up to Paris, there were two rooms. There was this technical process where you had experts debating very specific and practical strategies for change, which national negotiators were participating in. Then they'd go into the next room and they'd be negotiating the agreement.
So that's fascinating, because I assume a lot of people will be thinking with the LDCs in the sense that the technical capacity, the scientific data-driven approach, then a lot of people wouldn't attribute that to these parties. They would assume the West, would have the capital in this. So that is quite a shift.
Well, you had I think the dynamic in the lead up to Durban was an alliance which was called the Durban Alliance, actually, of the European Union and the least developed countries and AOSIS, and that was sort of like a meeting of the minds of how we're going to go about this process of change. On the other side, you had really, sort of then the emergence of what was called the like-minded developing countries, and that was sort of like a resistance and a preservation of this sort of top-down, principle-based style, and that was really used by some of the the Saudi Arabians, the Qataris, to sort of really slow down the negotiations, and China sort of playing both the whole way through.
Okay. Well, it's interesting too, because we're often, as I said, assuming things, and we're often given truths about people who are most at risk of climate change. The depictions for people like in the Marshall Islands and so forth is, hopeless, you have to move climate refugees. But this point about the difference between the truths that were told and the lived stories of actual people reminds me of Kathy Jetnil-Kejner's presentation in 2014 at the Climate Summit.
Yeah.
And an extraordinary, moving poet, mother and activist. And her depiction wasn't just moving, it was actually in many ways accurate, empowering in a way that other people may not have heard before. Are those stories, I mean, she's not in the room negotiating, but how much does that sort of narrative also affect where these go?
Yeah, I mean, I think one term that was coined around Paris was this idea of the promise of Paris, and and I think when I think of negotiation, part of it is the text, and it's what is written down. But a much bigger part of it is the sort of normative changes that are happening in parallel, many of which are not coded. They just become embedded in the way that people do things, and that those voices, particularly the voices of the vulnerable and the most impacted, they have that's the moral influence that they have, which is modifying the norms.
So we're talking about drafts now, so I'll ask you a few questions about that. But just beforehand, you mentioned before about the WhatsApp, if you could see how much is going on between messages and people, following people into bathrooms and so forth. I also hear from you and other people that negotiations last day and night, so 48 hours straight. Rooms are crammed, doors are shut, people are running back and forth, you're sleeping in the corridors, and it takes a toll. How can we change that process with COP26 coming up? I mean, being fatigued and so forth, is there a better way we can run these things?
Well, yes, although I'm not sure that there's much to negotiate in that sense at COP26, and I'll come back to the reason why that's so. But yes, I think it's a very unhealthy process. I mean, in all of the COPs, I went at least 2 nights without sleeping, in 2 or 3 of them, 3 nights without sleeping. And when you get to that point, you really start to lose your functioning. Yeah. And I'm sure that the quality of the actual substance of the negotiations is harmed by the way that it functions. But it's I think in a way that is a bit of a charade. Actually, in all of the COPs that I've been involved in, there has been a take it or leave it text, and that text has been constructed taking into account all of the views of the parties. There were many parties who would have preferred a kind of traditional line-by-line kind of approach, and that was actually attempted in the lead up to Paris. But most parties who have advocated that have done so because they want to slow down the negotiations.
Sure. Just for tactics, not because...
Yeah.
So, talking about negotiation then, most people's experience of negotiating every day is already fraught with difficulty. It's Friday night here, we have movie night, and there are 4 of us, 2 lawyers, and for a year, we can't reach consensus about what film we're going to watch, Yeah. The breakout room is where the 4-year-old is screaming because they want to watch Paddington, not Winnie the Pooh. So how do you do this with 170 plus countries? And it's not about what film we're going to watch tonight. This is a 35-year trajectory, effectively ending fossil-fueled industrial revolution time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there was a point where, and Copenhagen, there's a lot of positive that came out of that, and it wasn't completely done there, but at some point over that time from Durban through, there was a political imperative for all heads of state. They had to get to an agreement. That was immutable. And so once that threshold was reached, it became a question of the ambition in the agreement, the elements of the agreement. And so I suppose getting to that point involved the role of the Secretary-General bringing heads of state together, very, very good diplomacy, and kind of the social economic expectation that this would be dealt with. And there the role of faith communities, of key economic actors, even in the lead up to Paris, we were engaging with the defence community. Right. And I don't know if you remember, but there was a lot of very interesting analysis that came out in the lead up to Paris about
climate risk,
security risk, all of these kind of things.
I remember talking about faith as well, Laudato Si from Pope Francis. Yeah. It's our biggest existential threat. And it's always a good question when you ask students, you say, what are our greatest existential threats? And, well, actually, I put it to you, can you imagine what they would respond with? Biggest challenges for society. Forget about COVID beforehand.
Right.
Most of the answers tend to be about economy and stuff like that. And then you ask them, what do you think about the Pope or the US Department of Defense or the World Economic Forum? And then they'll talk about social cohesion and definitely security now and terrorism and definitely economics. You say all three of those institutions say this is it. And that's quite a big shift, as you say, the legitimacy now from those influencing bodies outside of the room. That really drove the capital to say, yeah, we need to get this done.
Yeah, but I think that the other thing that's worth just noting is that you don't get to that point organically. In my view, it's orchestrated, and the fact is that within the UN, within our team, we had a campaign running. So I was running the negotiations, and there was another guy who I work with, Tom, and he was running a sort of behind the scenes campaign, running sort of multiple councils of influencing actors, and we were working alongside each other. So I would tell him every morning, these are the issues, and then he would be reaching out with op-eds and telephone calls and that sort of stuff. So it is a campaign, and
this is organic. No, it really is. I felt bad. I was like, oh no, I look really corporate, but constantly advocating.
Yeah, I think that's what I mean about the sort of the advocacy of the process, and advocacy being within the process, so it was professionalised. But at the same time, you did have a much more political atmosphere, and people who sort of knew how to orchestrate the process to get to an outcome. And Christiana Figueres was sort of central in all of that.
Right. And actually, talking about getting to that, getting for that process towards the end, you were saying before too, a substantial amount of the text was actually done in the last couple of days.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we had multiple versions of the agreement drafted before we got to Paris, but that was more of an exercise of thinking through, where the landing grounds would be and how you might construct things to take into account different needs and balance. But in real time, there was this heavy negotiation running, and then in a room there was me and some other people with text on screen, and we were sort of running shuttle diplomacy back and forth. There were bilateral meetings being held with individual ministers. The question was, what's the one thing that you have to have in this agreement?
For each party.
It wasn't what can't you live with, right? It was about creating a dynamic where you had the best in the agreement. You weren't cutting out the worst. Of course, there were some things that we knew certain parties would not be able to tolerate. They wouldn't be able to adopt. In fact, the drama at the very end, which was about should or shall for the US, was one of those issues, which was mistakenly included in the text, and actually due to the fact that people like me hadn't slept for 3 days.
Well, you've mentioned this before, and I still find it fascinating, because, as you're saying, the one thing that they couldn't live without, and they desperately needed in there. And I can imagine behavioural psychologists and salespeople saying, that's what I do every day. I anchor somebody or prime them with the stimuli they want to hear, and then that frames the totality of the proposition so much more amenably. And what happened, though, after that process? I'm curious about this point now, because it's quite a long text. Did people skip to the thing that they were looking for sometimes, and once they got there, it's like, oh, that's in, then go to the rest of it? Or is it, as you were saying before, a line by line, people going through, going, okay, let's tick off?
Well, I think, what happens in that very end game is the text is published, everyone gets their copy, the delegations go through it line by line. There's a legal analysis, if you sense, going, what we can live with, what we can't, etc. And all the parties are doing that, and that's usually done at the level of the groups. I mean, I failed to mention before, in terms of power, the role of the G77 and China. By the way, we might come back to that. In that final sort of stage, there were very few things that parties couldn't live with. And I think that, there were such nuances, such fine balance. The negotiation had been going on for a very long time, so we kind of knew where the red lines were, it was really just that US one. And the issue there, by the way, was that they couldn't go to Congress.
Oh, right.
So what they needed was an agreement that wouldn't have required them to go to Congress to seek a legislative implementation of the Paris Agreement, adoption of that treaty. They needed to be able to do it by executive order based on their existing legislative mandate.
Oh my gosh, because that one word as well.
Yeah. Because shall is legally binding.
Sure, yeah. I understand. A question from another lawyer called Higham about the mechanism of Paris as well. So if we think about Kyoto, where there's quite defined periods and targets for each country, now we have an overall target, but it's in the future, and you're tasked with coming back in some years and telling us how you get there. So a lot of lawyers I've heard say, oh, that sounds like an agreement to agree, and I start worrying about enforceability and all that. So how did that mechanism become the agreement? Was that a requirement for people to say, oh, that I can accept?
Yeah, I mean, I think that when that model was finally when the negotiation started, there was a massive conceptual phase where different models were being debated, and the Kyoto was the standard, and in fact a lot of the discussion was tearing down the Kyoto Protocol and analysing it in terms of the sort of behavioural psychology, what it creates, how states tend to game it in terms of their numbers, that sort of thing. But I suppose back to your question, the idea was that what we really need to do is to move away from this idea of burden, because Kyoto was essentially, it had that model because it was about sharing the burden. But actually, if you remember the Stern review, I mean, basically what Stern said was that is bollocks. It is not about burden sharing. It is actually about maximising benefit, and you can come to that conclusion just about based on the economics of the benefits, let alone the costs associated with the impacts of climate change.
A nice reframe. But not saying you have to account for externalities, but actually benefit from a different way.
Yeah, so the agreement talks about parties in doing their NDCs coming with the highest possible ambition, about progression, and so
positive language.
It is all positive language. Yeah, it's about incentivising, and we haven't got to that point yet. Actually, I mean, we might come into this discussion where are we on the pathway. But I think the IEA report that just came out, the World Energy Outlook, is quite remarkable. And if you look at the way in which they are characterising the situation now compared to how they have and they've always been 5 years behind. But they're basically saying now that that renewable energy is the lowest cost. Actually, it's the cheapest form of electricity in history.
I remember the Breakthrough in Renewables was a documentary, and it was a project, I have to check, I think it was outside Dubai, to tender. And the one that won was the solar energy one, and it beat the gas price. It was less than $6 per kilowatt, it was like, you can't do that. And at that point, and this is in the Gulf, it's cheaper. And all the other arguments about that's the right thing to do, environment, of course, for many other people, it's like, well, what's cheaper? And that's a foregone conclusion then.
Yeah, I mean, that's now the situation in the vast majority of the world. And the other issue now is scale. I mean, now we're talking about scale, which is really mind-boggling. I mean, the scale of renewable energy projects is way bigger than nuclear. I mean, fathom a 15 gigawatt installation.